There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of a Japanese novel that was originally published in Japanese in 1959. The River Key by Sawako Ariyoshi. Translated from the Japanese by Mildred Tahara in around 1980 or something. So the first thing to say about this book, which I very much enjoyed, it was a 4-star read for me, is that it's quite difficult to find a hard copy. You might have the best luck getting it from your library. There are used copies online, but I read mine on the website archive.org, where they have scanned versions of the holdings of several libraries. I don't really quite understand the premise of archive.org, but they have a lot of stuff that you can't find electronically anywhere else, and it's totally legal and all that stuff. So I read it that way. A few years ago, I read a later novel. I believe that novel was published in the early 70s by Sawako Ariyoshi. I should say Ariyoshi Sawako, called The Twilight Years, also translated by Mildred Tahara, which I loved. That novel was contemporary in its day, set in contemporary Tokyo, late 1960s, early 1970s Japan, about a married woman with kids and also her in-laws, her elderly in-laws, living in the cabin behind their house in metropolitan Tokyo, and all the cares, worries, and concerns that cramped familial life engendered. It was a wonderful novel. I will put a link to my review in the show notes. So I was really quite eager to read more by Ariyoshi Sawako, and I have finally done it, reading what some of the reviews say is her debut from 1959, but I don't think it is her debut. It's an early novel. It wasn't as good as The Twilight Years, but I still am really glad that I read it. This one is a historical novel which opens in the twilight years, shall we say, of the 19th century in the Japanese prefecture of Wakayama. I happen to be a little bit familiar with it because good friends of mine from Tokyo very recently moved there. Anyway, it is south of Osaka, and Wakayama is both a city and a prefecture, and Wakayama City is where Ariyoshi herself was born in 1931. This is a historical novel of really 4 generations of Japanese women. It's a matrilineal saga, shall we say. At the opening of the story, it's really the main character, Hana, who is about to get married. And her mother died when she was a child, so her grandmother has arranged this marriage, and she's marrying a man who's living down the river, the River Key. I don't know why they call it the River Key in the English translation, because it is the river, it is Kinokawa, Kawa meaning river, so it's the Kino River, so I guess they just shortened it a bit for the English translation. Hana's father doesn't think this enterprising young man down the river is the best match in terms of wealth or social status, but Hana's grandmother insists, and one of the reasons that she insists is that she considers it bad luck for a bride to marry a man up the river. Down the river is the way to go, otherwise you're tempting fate. And so the River Key is really, in a sense, one of the main characters. Hana's procession, and it is a procession, down the River Key, several miles, several kilometers down the, I don't know how many, but several hours down the river is one of the best parts of the book, because all of old Japan is there in the ritualistic procession down the river that Hana embarks upon to her new life with her husband, who I think she'd met for about 5 minutes once a few years before. And she really has very little to do with her birth family, including her grandmother, for the rest of her life. She really subsumes herself into her husband's family. Her husband's not a bad guy. He's not a great guy. He seems like kind of a sexy guy. But their relationship is very traditional, both sexually and in terms of what the expectations of her. She is not necessarily welcomed into the home by her mother-in-law, and her brother-in-law is particularly unfriendly. And it's the relationship between Hana and her brother-in-law, who is unmarried and just seems to have a big chip on his shoulder, that is one of the more interesting relationships in the entire novel. I will come back to that. She starts a family, Her husband has political ambitions and eventually rises to national prominence, but at first starts out to be really an incredibly important man within the prefecture, Wakayama Prefecture. The family that Hana has married into is not nearly as cultured as the family that she came from, and she kind of represses a lot of her stuff, like she doesn't play the koto. She was raised on tea ceremony and playing the koto and stuff, and this new family is a little bit, shall we say, hickish. So her talents there are not particularly welcomed or encouraged. So it's a big life change for her. And so in the story of Hana and her marriage and the family that she raises, we really get a picture of the situation for women at that time in the mid-Meiji era, the end of the 19th century. She raises a family, and her eldest daughter is Humio, and Humio grows up to be a feminist rebel. And she doesn't like all the old Japanese ways, especially the way Japan puts down women, and you can't help but like her politics, and she is a really difficult daughter to love. And you can just imagine Hana, raised the way she was, dealing with this rebellious, defiant daughter who flat out refuses to play the koto or do this or do that, and wants to go to university in Tokyo and does, and this and that. And their relationship is very conflicted. And then, I'm not going to give you too much more of the plot, but then Humio has a daughter, Hanako. And so it's really those three women that this novel, it's divided into 3 sections, and each section kind of focuses on the coming of age of the 3 women. It was really interesting, and it reminded me in many ways of Jun'ichirō Tanizaki's fabulous novel, The Makioka Sisters. But by the end, I realized it wasn't as good as that, and nor was it as good as Ariyoshi's later novel, The Twilight Years. But I still really enjoyed it. It really conveyed so much about Japanese culture. So if you're interested in Japanese culture and how it changed over time, this novel does a fabulous job. Things like art and pottery and music and all those aspects of the culture are described in rich detail. I absolutely loved it. Where the novel fell down a bit in my esteem was that it felt kind of info-dumpy about the way history was moving in the political history, and it didn't really, in a satisfying way that I expect from literary fiction that incorporates historical things into its narrative. It just felt like, Wikipedia didn't exist when Ariyoshi was writing the book, but it just felt like a bunch of facts and figures were kind of dumped in rather than it all working together. And I would say my main criticism of the book is what I care about the most when I read a novel is character development. I am very much interested in and judge a book based on the character work. And the character work here was not that great. It wasn't terrible. So I like to say in a novel that I love, the characters jump off the page. But if it's not that good, but it's still good, then I say the characters didn't jump off the page, but they at least sat up. In this novel, the characters sat up, but they didn't jump off the page. So I would have liked to have seen more deeper characterization, and in particular, this weird relationship, this love-hate relationship between Hana and her brother-in-law, the way that that's charted, it was interesting. It held my interest. All of the characters were interesting. The story was really interesting, but it just got a little bit ham-handed in places, showing that strange relationship. And I don't mean a romantic relationship, although there was some maybe romantic yearnings between sister-in-law and brother-in-law, but it just felt like something was missing in that, the way that relationship was portrayed. And I didn't feel that any of the characters quite came to life. However, if you're interested in the history of Japanese women and any aspect of Japanese culture, I still think there's a lot in this novel to enjoy, so I recommend it with that reservation. If you really want to sink your teeth into a lavishly rich literary novel about Japanese women of this same period, read Makioka Sisters by Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. This one, I don't think you should pass it by, but it's not a masterpiece. I'm glad I read it, and I think that you might want to check it out too. Thanks for watching.